Hi everyone, my name is Ruperto Ancajas and I'm a portfolio specialist at Foord Asset Management. Today, we're going to be talking benchmarks. Are they still relevant? How does an investor use it when trying to gauge their investments? Sharing his thoughts with us today, we have Brian Arcese. He's a portfolio manager of the Foord International Fund, which is managed with an objective in mind, and he's also a fund manager of the Global Equity Fund, which manages with a benchmark in mind. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Roberto.
Why do you think there's even a need for a benchmark? What's its purpose?
I think conventionally, there are really three reasons why investors use benchmarks. The first is simply for measurement, right? Measurement of performance against some type of yardstick, and so a benchmark can serve a purpose in measuring against it. The second can be for kind of setting in place guidelines or portfolio construction parameters. So some clients may want portfolios that are constructed against a benchmark. And then the final reason is really as a way to look at and measure risk. So traditionally, risk is measured by looking at either volatility or tracking error of a portfolio, but relative to a benchmark.
Okay. Well, does Foord employ benchmarks in the three ways that you've mentioned?
So we do use benchmarks in a more unique way. We view ourselves primarily as benchmark-agnostic. So if we look at kind of those three ways separately, and we take performance as the first one.
Okay.
Right? So for our portfolios, what we often do is show portfolio performance against more than one benchmark, because we don't craft to a benchmark. And we think that showing against multiple benchmarks is a more sensible way of kind of holistically showing a performance of a portfolio. And the reason being, just as an example, if we take China, for example, the country weight in the most widely used global equity benchmark, it's only 2 to 3% of the benchmark.
Right.
But if we look at a GDP global equity weighted benchmark, China's 20% of that benchmark. So obviously, the performance of the two benchmarks, despite them both being global equity benchmarks, will differ significantly over time. And so while we don't craft our portfolio to either one, we're certainly happy to show performance against both because we think that it shows a more fair picture through time. From a construction standpoint, again, we're aware of how a benchmark is constructed, but we don't collar ourselves to the sector or region weightings within a given benchmark, for example. So again, just if you look at energy as a sector, just as an example, it bottomed at only 3% of a global equity benchmark, whereas today we have 12% of our portfolio invested in the energy sector, given the opportunities that exist there. And if we crafted to a traditional global equity benchmark, we wouldn't really be able to take advantage of those opportunities to the magnitude that we are by being more unconstrained. And then finally, we differ and believe we're unique in how we look at and manage risk relative to a benchmark. So for us, we believe that the true kind of measure of risk, and risk is defined as permanent loss of capital. So it isn't necessarily measured most appropriately as volatility or tracking error around a benchmark, because volatility can be as much opportunity as it is risk. And so those are the three ways that we're aware of the benchmark, but we do use them quite differently than how a traditional asset manager would look at and use them.
So have traditional benchmarks gone haywire? Have they got it wrong?
I wouldn't go so far as to say they've got it wrong, but I would say that it's important to use them as they are, as a tool, but not necessarily as a rule. So again, if I look at China as an example, that most widely used global equity benchmark has China at that 2 to 3% weight. The weighting in our portfolio, given how attractive the opportunity set is currently there, is above 20%, right? So if you look at our portfolio relative to that traditional global equity benchmark, you would say that our weight in China is 10 times as high. But if you look at our weighting in China relative to a global equity benchmark, it's in line. So it really is important to look at a number of different benchmarks when evaluating a portfolio, because if you just choose one, So they haven't necessarily got it wrong, but if you only choose one and use it as a rule, then it's not probably providing the right color that you need or the right lens to look through when evaluating a particular portfolio or fund.
Yeah, I remember that back in the day when technology was just a very small portion of the global benchmark, and post the dot-com bubble, it shot up and it provided a lot of unintended risk for investors who were already invested in that sort of benchmark. So it's a similar story here.
Exactly.
Okay, well, are there opportunities then, being benchmark agnostic?
Yeah, in our view, there are a lot of opportunities in being benchmark agnostic. I mean, you need to open the opportunity set for an investment manager to add value. You need to be aware of the benchmark. So some asset managers talk about being sort of benchmark unaware. I always think it's kind of a funny way of defining it, because I think you should be aware of what's in a benchmark. So we like to say we're benchmark agnostics. We don't construct to the benchmark, but at the same time, you have to be risk aware. Just because you're benchmark agnostic doesn't mean that you have 100% of your portfolio in a single security, for example. You're still managing for a risk-adjusted return over the long term. You're just not necessarily required to hold fast to what the benchmark weights are for a sector or region.
Then how do you account for liquidity risks and concentration risks in a benchmark agnostic strategy?
Yeah, I think so. Being benchmark agnostic and constructing a portfolio kind of separately from how the benchmark is constructed, it isn't necessarily any more risky than managing a portfolio constructed to a benchmark. The reason being is that you're still taking risk into account. So for us, as I mentioned, I mean, risk is defined as permanent loss of capital, not necessarily as volatility. So we're looking at, we're really guarding steadfastly against the permanent loss of capital, not only at the portfolio level, but also at the individual security level. You're still building a diversified portfolio. You're just focused on building a portfolio of securities that gives you a risk-adjusted return over the long term. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking outsized risk in a given portfolio simply because you're benchmark agnostic.
So the importance of benchmarks, it's nuanced, right? And they do play a role. If a client wants to see how far the benchmark is from a risk perspective, a performance perspective, but they also have to take into account many other things and understand that just because a benchmark has traditionally been there, it doesn't mean that it's relevant or it's representative of what's going on in the world, because risk appetite change, unintended risks of change. So thank you for watching, and Brian, thank you for being with us.